4 o'clock. Hearing will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. Among the potential partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, Vietnam is the only country that bans independent religious groups, the only country considered one of the world's worst violators of internet freedom. Vietnam harbors severe child labor and forced child labor violators, and regularly jails and tortures those who speak out for human rights, political inclusion, or the right to practice their religion. There are today over 100 prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. Nguyen Van Dai spent 4 years in jail and 4 additional years under house arrest for defending religious freedom and calling for greater democratization in Vietnamese society. He was detained again and brutally beaten last December for continuing his work. His arbitrary detention undercuts any claim that the current Vietnamese leadership can become a trusted U.S. partner. Prior to his arrest, I had the privilege of meeting with him in Hanoi at his law office at 10 Duane Tran Nhiep Street in December of 2005. I was deeply impressed with his passion for truth, his defense of universally recognized human rights, his faith, his extraordinary courage, and his deep and abiding love for Vietnam. He is truly a patriot. Nguyen Van Dai's wife, Vu Minh Khan, is with us today to speak on his behalf and for the other prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. Her testimony is especially timely because President Obama will travel to Vietnam at the end of this month. A steady stream of State Department officials are going to Vietnam prior to the trip. In fact, Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Tom Malinowski, is in Vietnam today. The administration should not try to whitewash Vietnam's record prior to the president's trip, but must make absolutely clear and unequivocal statements in support of democracy and free speech advocates, disfavored religious and ethnic minority groups, and human rights defenders. The unconditional release of Nguyen Van Dai and other prisoners of conscience should be a precondition of the president's visit. However, if the president goes without any conditionality, this subcommittee appeals to the president to demand the immediate and unconditional freedom and release of Nguyen Van Dai and the others. I also encourage the president to meet with those in Vietnam who share our interests in democracy and human rights in Vietnam. Doing so will send a clear message about U.S. interests to the vast majority of Vietnamese, some 66%, who were born after the Vietnam War ended. The administration should also make clear to the communist leaders in Hanoi that the further expansion of trade and security partnerships, the lifting of the arms embargo, is unacceptable until there is significant, verifiable, and irreversible improvements in human rights in Vietnam. Unfortunately, for the past 7+ years, the administration has failed to deliver such messages to victims of abuse anywhere. No tough message was delivered in Cuba, for example, despite an escalation of arrests and abuse. The administration seems eager to proceed with lucrative trade and to lift the ban on lethal arms sales to Vietnam without imposing any real conditions. That would be a colossal mistake. The administration surely will justify extending these generous benefits by arguing that lifting the trade barriers and expanding diplomatic engagement with Vietnam will bring about human rights and other positive advances. Such arguments have long been discredited, however, in China, for example, or more recently in Bahrain. And there is evidence such arguments failed miserably in Vietnam as well. In 2007, after the United States lifted its longstanding objection to Vietnam's membership in the World Trade Organization, Hanoi responded by launching the first of 3 waves of arrests that jailed more than 100 dissidents and introduced sweeping new laws restricting freedom of association, assembly, and the internet. In short, Vietnam's WTO membership allowed the communist government made it free to jail, torture, and to abuse. The pressure was off. Why would they not do so again? The communist leadership in Hanoi will take our benefits, our trade benefits, our security commitments, and continue repressing those seeking political reform and universal freedoms. The business of the Communist Party is staying in power and repressing those who may challenge their power. They will not embrace human rights improvements or the rule of law unless it is a condition of better relations with the United States. Vietnam needs the U.S. markets and security commitments much more than the United States needs Vietnam's markets and security cooperation. The administration should demand additional protections for human rights, internet freedom, and the rule of law as a condition of U.S. assistance. Not doing so is short-sighted, misguided, and fails to achieve long-term U.S. interests, and it throws the victims under the bus. One way to send an important message about U.S. policy priorities is to pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act, H.R. 2140, which I have reintroduced in this Congress and is now awaiting further action in the House and Senate. I would note parenthetically that past iterations that I've introduced the Vietnam Human Rights Act in previous Congresses have passed the House 3 times, only to be ignored in the Senate. The bill stipulates that the United States cannot increase non-humanitarian assistance to Vietnam until the President certifies that the government of Vietnam has made substantial progress in establishing human rights protections. The American people should not have to subsidize torture or underwrite the jailing of journalists, religious leaders, labor activists, or advocates of democracy or internet freedom. The bipartisan Vietnam Human Rights Act will restore the right priorities to U.S. policy towards Vietnam. The Communist Party is not Vietnam's future. That future lies with Nguyen Van Dai and many other advocates of political reform and human rights who seek our freedoms more than our trade. U.S. policy must send the unmistakable message to the government of Vietnam that human rights improvements are fundamental to better relations, critically linked to our mutual economic and security interests, and will not, I say again, will not be ignored or be bargained away. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished witness today, Ms. Vu Minh Khanh, who is the wife of human rights lawyer Mr. Nguyen Van Dai, as I said earlier, who was arrested in December 16th to be exact, in 2015 under Article 88 of the Vietnamese Penal Code for, quote, conducting propaganda against the state. Since his arrest, Ms. Vu has been advocating for his release, meeting with international delegates, starting petitions and giving interviews with various media agencies to raise awareness on Dai's case. She has volunteered at a church in Hanoi and has been doing so since 2009. The church reaches out to many vulnerable groups, including those who suffer from drug addiction, orphans, and youth. In addition to providing support and counseling to those groups, Ms. Vu also assists with the daily financial management of the organization and works to promote and protect human rights through the church. You want to go now? After you're finished. I'd like to now yield to our distinguished chairman of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Ed Royce.
I just would start by thanking Chris Smith for holding this hearing at exactly the right time, because now is the time we have got to get the attention of the international community on these human rights abuses. And so, yes, in a few weeks, the President of the United States is going to be traveling to Vietnam. And while maintaining peace in the South China Sea and improving trade ties is an important shared goal, the administration must carefully take into account Vietnam's human rights abuses as this relationship develops. And that is the conundrum, because this has not gotten better. I've met with the Venerable Thich Quang Do, as well as one of the other religious leaders in Vietnam when they were under house arrest years ago. I heard about the circumstances. I check in with human rights NGOs, And as we all know, this situation is not improving. Human rights have got to be at the very top of the President's agenda. No matter how the administration frames our relationship, the reality, as we all know, is that Vietnam remains a one-party communist state with significant human rights abuses. And as we will hear today from the wife of an imprisoned human rights lawyer and activist, and I want to thank Chris Smith for his efforts here to elevate this issue, but as we'll hear, Nguyen Van Dai, she'll share with us the reality that Vietnam has a long, long way to go. In December, Nguyen Van Dai was badly beaten by government, well, I guess we should call them thugs, because they beat her and taken into custody. And since that time, took her husband into custody. And since that time, he's been denied access to his lawyer and even his family. He sits in solitary confinement. His condition is unknown, and Ms. Vu is rightly concerned. Sadly, Nguyen Van Dai's treatment is far from an isolated incident. According to Human Rights Watch, police still frequently, Human Rights Watch says they frequently torture suspects to elicit confessions and sometimes use excessive force in responding to protests over evictions, land confiscation, because land grabbing is one of the things the party does, and other social issues. So last year, more than 40 bloggers and rights activists were beaten by plainclothes government agents. Not surprisingly, not one of these thugs who did the beating was held responsible. Vietnam's penal code criminalizes criticism of the government and abuse of democratic freedoms, while other laws restrict freedom of religion and the media. Bloggers like, An Ba Sam and Nguyen Minh Tai Tu Y and Nguyen Ngoc Gaye remain in prison for their advocacy of human rights, imprisoned for what the state or what the Communist Party calls abusing the rights to freedom of democracy. Not surprisingly, Vietnam now ranks in the world 175th out of 180 countries for press freedom. Now that means Vietnam is behind Cuba. It's worse than Saudi Arabia. It's worse than Iran. That's why we're here at this hearing. Freedom of religion is a significant concern in Vietnam as the government continues to restrict religious practice through registration requirements, through harassment, through surveillance. Branches of the Cao Dai and Wo Hao Buddhist Church and independent Catholics and Protestants are banned. They face government harassment for their peaceful religious practice. The Venerable Thi Quang Do, who both Chairman Smith and I have met with, has remained under house arrest since 1998 for his religious beliefs. If the United States and Vietnam are to build a stronger relationship, the Vietnamese government must honor the basic human rights of the Vietnamese people with respect to freedom of speech, religion, assembly. And that's the message the President of the United States needs to send during his upcoming visit. I wrote to the President last week asking that he carry exactly that message. We are all watching. The President's trip cannot be a replay of his trip to Havana. We have to have these issues addressed. And Mr. Chairman, thank you again for calling this important and timely hearing.
Chairman Rice, thank you for your very eloquent and very strong statement and consistent support for the human rights advocates in Vietnam, and especially today for Nguyen Van Dai, who is suffering. Again, he is back into prison, as I said in my opening. 4 years of prison, 4 years of house arrest, and without objection, a very, very well-written appeal that Ms. Vu made at the time of that first arrest. Without objection, I would like to make it a part of the record, and I yield the floor to Ms. Vu for such time as she may consume.
Trước hết, tôi chân thành cảm ơn Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ, cảm ơn ông Chris Smith và ông Ed Roy đã cho tôi có cơ hội, và các quý vị ở tại đây đã cho tôi có cơ hội hết sức quý giá này.
First of all, I would like to deeply thank Chairman Chris Smith and also Chairman Ed Royce having given me this precious opportunity to speak.
Tôi là Vũ Minh Khánh, vợ luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài. Vợ chồng tôi đều là cơ đốc nhân. Tôi đang hầu việc Chúa tại một hội thánh ở Hà Nội. Chồng tôi là luật sư bảo vệ nhân quyền đang bị cầm tù.
My name is Vu Minh Khanh, wife of attorney Nguyễn Văn Đài. We both are Protestants, myself serving our church in Hanoi. Đài is a human rights defender, now in jail.
Chồng tôi bị bắt lần đầu vào năm 2007, bị kết án 4 năm tù giam và 4 năm quản chế vì tội tuyên truyền chống nhà nước xã hội chủ nghĩa Việt Nam theo Điều 88 Bộ Luật Hình sự, bị tước thẻ luật sư và đóng cửa văn phòng luật sư.
My husband was first arrested in 2007, then sentenced to 4 years imprisonment, plus 4 years of house arrest for violating Article 88 of Vietnam's Penal Code for, quote-unquote, conducting propaganda against the state, end quote. My husband was disbarred and his law office was shut down.
Ngày 16 tháng 12 năm 2015, sau khi hết giam lỏng 4 năm tại gia, được 9 tháng thì chồng tôi bị bắt giam, bị khởi tố theo Điều 88 Bộ Luật Hình sự. Đã gần 5 tháng, tôi không biết tin tức gì. Chồng tôi bị giam cách ly, không cho gặp người nhà, luật sư không được tham gia.
After having just completed his house arrest, my husband was arrested again on December 16th, 2015, and charged with under the same Article 88. My husband had been detained for almost 5 months now, yet I have not received any information about him. He has been held incommunicado and not allowed to meet with my family, myself, nor with his defense lawyers.
Mỗi tháng 2 lần tôi được đem thức ăn đến trại B14. Tôi không biết chồng tôi có nhận được thức ăn không. Tôi cũng không biết chồng tôi có mặt ở trong trại B14 này hay không. Vì ở Việt Nam, công an họ làm điều họ muốn. Nếu có chuyển trại giam thì họ cũng không thông báo cho người nhà. Đã có trường hợp blogger Điếu Cày và Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức bị như vậy. Chẳng hạn nếu chồng tôi bị tra tấn, tôi cũng không thể biết. Chồng tôi bị áp lực tinh thần, thậm chí bị lừa dối bởi những tin tức giả mạo, tôi cũng không thể biết được. Bị bắt gần 5 tháng nhưng chồng tôi không được ai bảo vệ, bị cô lập hoàn toàn.
Twice a month, I am permitted to bring food to detention center B14 in Hanoi for his daily needs, but I do not know if he has received any. In fact, I honestly do not know if he is really held at B14 because in Vietnam, the public security force can do whatever they want. If they transfer inmates, they do not inform the family members accordingly. For example, this has happened to blogger Điếu Cày and currently happened with Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức. Thus, if in fact my husband has been tortured physically and or mentally or given false information, I would not know.
Họ cũng không cho tôi gửi kinh thánh, dù cuốn kinh thánh đó do ông đại sứ sứ quán Mỹ tặng để tôi gửi cho chồng tôi.
My husband has not been allowed to receive a copy of the Bible, a gift from the U.S. Ambassador, Mr. Ted Osius.
Chưa kể đến là trước khi bị bắt 10 ngày, chồng tôi bị đánh đập rất nặng bởi hàng chục người cầm gậy dài đánh. Đó là ngày chồng tôi mở lớp dạy về nhân quyền cho khoảng 60 người ở tỉnh Nghệ An, cách nhà tôi 300 km. Vừa bị đánh 10 ngày, vết thương chưa lành thì chồng tôi lại bị bắt giam.
Specifically, 10 days before his arrest, he was attacked and severely injured following a human rights training session for about 60 people in Nghệ An province, about 300 kilometers from Hanoi. Having been attacked 10 days prior, his injuries had not healed. He was then arrested on December 16.
Trong quá trình hoạt động cho nhân quyền, chồng tôi luôn bị theo dõi, đe dọa, sách nhiễu, đánh đập. Những lần tấn công này luôn liên quan đến những việc làm mà chính quyền không thích và yêu cầu chồng tôi không nên làm. Nhưng chồng tôi cho rằng đó là những quyền của chồng tôi theo hiến pháp Việt Nam và luật quốc tế. Vì chồng tôi bị công an theo dõi ngày và đêm, cho nên chính quyền Việt Nam chắc chắn phải biết rất rõ về những hung thủ đã xâm phạm đến sức khỏe của chồng tôi. Nhưng chính quyền nói rằng họ không tìm ra thủ phạm khi chồng tôi làm đơn tố cáo. Chồng tôi chấp nhận rủi ro cao độ hoạt động và đó cũng là số phận chung của những người hoạt động nhân quyền tại Việt Nam.
Throughout his human rights activism, my husband was constantly followed, threatened, harassed, and beaten. Each time Dai was attacked, it related to his work because the government did not like it and had requested him to stop doing human rights work. However, my husband believes that his activities are within his rights under the Vietnamese constitution and international law. Because the police constantly follow my husband all day, I believe that the Vietnamese government would know clearly who attacked him. However, the government has claimed that they do not know who the assailants were when my husband filed a complaint. My husband accepted the high risks that come with these activities, and in fact, this is the reality that human rights activists in Vietnam have to face constantly.
Chồng tôi bị bệnh viêm gan B, vì vậy tôi cũng rất lo lắng cho sức khỏe của chồng tôi.
My husband also has hepatitis B. Therefore, I am very worried about his health condition.
Chồng tôi là người được tiếp cận nền dân chủ tại Đức, được chứng kiến bức tường Berlin sụp đổ. Chồng tôi trở về Việt Nam, học đại học luật và trở thành luật sư. Năm 1997, chồng tôi ứng cử đại biểu Quốc hội với hy vọng nói lên tiếng nói của người dân. Năm 2000, chồng tôi chính thức hoạt động mạnh mẽ, đấu tranh cho tự do tôn giáo và là luật sư bảo vệ nhân quyền. Vụ án đầu tiên chồng tôi bảo vệ nhân quyền là năm 2000, khi chồng tôi bào chữa cho một tín hữu Tin Lành bị đưa ra tòa vì bà này ngăn cản công an đến giải tán buổi cầu nguyện của Hội Thánh.
My husband experienced democracy initially in Germany, having witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. He then returned to Vietnam and studied to become a lawyer. In 1997, my husband ran for the National Assembly with the hope that he could speak up for the people. In 2000, my husband officially began his activism and fought for freedom of religion. The first human rights case my husband took was in 2000 when he defended a member of the Protestant church who was brought to court because she tried to stop the police when they came to disband a prayer service at the local church.
Từ đó, chồng tôi giúp miễn phí cho những cơ đốc nhân bị đàn áp về mặt tôn giáo, những người đấu tranh cho dân chủ và nhân quyền bị sách nhiễu và bị bắt giam, những dân oan bị mất đất, mất nhà, những người bị đánh đập, bị bỏ tù oan sai, tổ chức các lớp học về nhân quyền tại văn phòng luật sư của mình.
Thereafter, my husband provided free legal services to the Christians who were oppressed based on their religion, those who fought for democracy and human rights, who are harassed and detained, victims of land grabs or home loss, and to people who were physically attacked and arbitrarily detained. He also led training courses about human rights at his law office.
Trong suốt quá trình hoạt động từ năm 2000 đến nay, trừ 4 năm bị tù giam từ 2007 đến 2011, vừa ra khỏi tù thì ngay lập tức chồng tôi tiếp tục lên tiếng, tiếp tục bảo vệ nhân quyền. Ngay cả bị tù quản chế tại gia, chồng tôi luôn tích cực đấu tranh bảo vệ quyền tự do tôn giáo, tự do ngôn luận, tự do lập hội một cách ôn hòa bằng cách giáo dục về nhân quyền. Chồng tôi luôn chú trọng đến việc đào tạo thế hệ trẻ, giúp đỡ nhiều sinh viên hoạt động nhân quyền, mở lớp dạy nhân quyền cho nhiều tầng lớp nhân dân, viết các bài viết phổ biến kiến thức pháp luật. Chồng tôi thường kết hợp với nhiều người, liên kết với các tổ chức trong nước và vận động với các chính phủ trên thế giới. Chồng tôi có mối quan hệ tốt với các sứ quán của nhiều nước tại Việt Nam và nhiều viên chức của nhiều chính phủ trên thế giới.
Since he started his activism in 2000, aside from the 4 years he was imprisoned and right upon his release, my husband immediately continued to raise his voice to protect human rights, even when he was still under house arrest. And he always fervently tried to fight for freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly through nonviolent methods and through providing education on human rights. My husband always focused on empowering the youth and helped many students who are human rights activists. He started classes on human rights for different people within society and wrote articles on the rule of law. My husband usually worked with many others and connected organizations with each other within the country. He also advocated with foreign governments as he had a good working relationship with many embassies in Vietnam and government officials from around the world.
Bối cảnh chồng tôi bị bắt năm 2007 là công an bắt khi tại văn phòng luật sư của chồng tôi đang mở lớp dạy nhân quyền cho sinh viên. Giáo trình dạy là cuốn Xã hội dân sự do Chính sứ quán Mỹ tại Việt Nam phát hành.
Regarding my husband's arrest in 2007, the police arrested him at his law office while he was teaching a class on human rights to his students. The topic of the class was based on a book on civil society, which the American Embassy in Vietnam had published.
Bối cảnh bị bắt lần này là chồng tôi đang đi gặp phái đoàn Liên minh châu Âu, lúc đó đang có mặt ở Việt Nam để đối thoại về nhân quyền.
As for his arrest this time, it was while my husband was leaving the house to meet with the delegation from the European Union who were in Vietnam for the annual European Union Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue.
Hiện nay chồng tôi đang phải đối diện với khung hình phạt tù từ 3 năm đến 20 năm.
My husband is currently facing from 3 to 20 years imprisonment.
Chồng tôi đã hoạt động tích cực để bảo vệ nhân quyền và các hoạt động này không thể bị cho là tội hình sự. Do đó tôi mong Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ và Chính phủ Hoa Kỳ giúp tôi đòi trả tự do tức khắc và vô điều kiện cho chồng tôi.
He has worked hard to protect human rights, and these activities cannot possibly be seen as criminal. Therefore, I hope that Congress and the U.S. government, especially President Obama on his trip to Vietnam, will help demand for his immediate and unconditional release.
Tôi chân thành cảm ơn quý dân biểu đã lắng nghe câu chuyện của gia đình tôi.
I sincerely thank you for spending time to listen to my husband's case. Respectfully.
Ms. Vu, I would like to thank you for your absolutely compelling testimony that will be heard by many in America and hopefully around the world. As you've been telling your story, I'm glad that other news outlets have not only carried your op-eds and your very profound words and sentiments, but know that the Congress as well is listening very carefully. I want to thank C-SPAN for being here so that a larger American audience will get to hear you and to realize that things are horrific for your husband. I do have a couple of questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Bin for doing the translation today for us. Deeply appreciate that, and for your advocacy as well. I have a couple of questions. You know, you point out in your testimony that your husband was arrested this second time as he was leaving the house to meet with a delegation from the European Union who were in Vietnam for the annual EU-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue. And I'm wondering, first of all, I believe the dialogues are essential, but they should not be seen as a substitute for very significant, tangible impacts and consequences to countries like Vietnam, the government of Vietnam, that commits egregious violations of human rights against its own people. Dialogue is great. We need to talk. No one's ever suggesting that talk needs to be suspended, but it needs to be linked to real consequences in the real world, like the lifting of an arms embargo, like greater trade and other kinds of interactions between the two governments. I'm wondering if any of the members of the European Parliament who are here for that dialogue have raised their voices in support of your husband after he was arrested, again, en route to meet with them, to dialogue with them about what the government is doing on human rights in Vietnam.
Khi mà chồng tôi đi gặp phái đoàn Liên minh châu Âu vào cái ngày chồng tôi bị bắt, thì thật sự là tôi cũng không biết là cái nội dung mà chồng tôi nói với họ là gì. Nhưng mà sau khi chồng tôi bị bắt thì Liên minh châu Âu có mời tôi đến tại văn phòng để gặp gỡ và hỏi thăm tình hình. Thì tôi cũng biết rằng Liên minh châu Âu họ cũng đang rất là quan tâm tới việc để trả tự do cho chồng tôi ạ.
I am not sure what transpired between the conversation of my husband and the European Union delegates who met with my husband prior to his arrest. But I do know that after his arrest, they actually contacted me and met with me and show a lot of support.
That's so extremely important. This is a united world, not just the United States, speaking about these universally recognized human rights. I would hope as well, as you point out in your testimony, that the continued gross mistreatment of your husband and others would become the subject of the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, where Vietnam sits in a place of dignity as a member of that council. It is breathtakingly disturbing that an abuser of human rights could simultaneously be an arbiter of how well or poorly other countries are doing. First, fix your own house and get that in order. So I think we need to press the case there as well. Let me ask you, if I could, about the how you have been treated by the authorities. You mentioned in your testimony that an attempt for his defense attorneys to get certificates has not been allowed. Could you further elaborate on what that process is all about and how you yourself have been treated when you advocate on behalf of your husband?
Cảm ơn câu hỏi của ông. Khi mà chồng tôi bị bắt thì ngay lập tức tôi đã mời luật sư. Và hiện nay thì tôi đang mời 3 người, một người ở Hà Nội là luật sư, một người ở Hà Nội và 2 người ở Hồ Chí Minh. Họ đều làm đơn để muốn tham gia vào vụ án, nhưng họ đều bị từ chối bằng công văn của chính công an Việt Nam, nói rằng anh Đài xâm phạm an ninh quốc gia cho nên không được quyền gặp luật sư. Còn bản thân tôi thì cũng đấu tranh, cũng hỏi cho về việc thăm gặp, nhưng mà tôi cũng bị từ chối vì nói rằng tôi không thể vào thăm chồng được vì lý do chồng tôi phạm tội an ninh quốc gia. Vâng, và những cái áp lực mà tôi phải chịu thì đó là tôi thấy ở trước cửa nhà tôi có một cái máy camera chiếu vào nhà tôi ngày và đêm. Tiếp theo đó là khi mà tôi làm thủ tục để đòi hỏi những cái quyền lợi chính đáng của chồng tôi đang ở trong nơi lao tù, ví dụ như quyền được thăm nuôi, quyền được gửi kinh thánh và cái việc có thêm người nhà ngoài tôi trong cái việc thăm nuôi, ví dụ như mẹ hoặc là anh chị em, thì tôi bị gây cản trở và khó khăn. Rồi tôi cũng có gửi đơn khiếu nại nhưng mà tôi không được trả lời. Và tất nhiên bản thân tôi cũng bị áp lực rất là lo lắng bởi vì chồng tôi bị giam cách ly, tôi không có năm cách ly, và tình trạng sức khỏe của chồng tôi thì vừa mới bị đánh rất là nặng và chồng tôi bị bệnh viêm gan B nữa, cho nên đó là những điều tôi đang rất là lo lắng ạ.
So in short, after his arrest, when I hired 3 lawyers, they were refused to be able to meet with Dai nor able to proceed with any legal actions for his case, to prepare for his case. As for myself, I noticed that there's a camera constantly in front of my house, following all my activities in front of the house. And I have tried to visit my husband and always deny to see my husband when he is incommunicado. In addition, I have requested to be able to bring him the Bible or have rights, visitation rights, and or for other family members to visit him, but have all been denied. I have written complaints, but I have not received any verbal or written response from the government.
Can you tell us, to the best of your knowledge, how your husband was treated when he was imprisoned the first time? Obviously 4 years in prison, followed by 4 years of house arrest. What were the prison conditions like?
Năm 2007 thì chồng tôi bị ở một cái điều kiện rất là tồi tệ. Có khoảng 60 người tù ở trong một cái căn phòng rất là chật hẹp, và mọi cái điều kiện sinh hoạt nó rất là tồi tệ. Nước ở trong trại tù đó thì rất là bẩn, ở cái mức độ mà mọi người phải dùng những cái đôi bít tất để lọc nước, và nó liên tục bị dày đặc lên bởi vì rất là nhiều đất và những cái chất dơ ở tại đó. Rồi những cái người tù họ đánh cãi nhau, rồi họ áp lực đánh những cái người tù họ đánh cãi nhau, và cũng có những cái người tù là theo dõi chồng tôi, và sống ở trong cái bối cảnh hết sức là tệ. Rồi không có một cái một cái gì đó để có thể thư giãn về mặt tinh thần, và ngày đêm bị cái sự theo dõi và quản thúc ạ.
So to complete her previous statement, she had also mentioned that the harassment puts a mental stress on her, and also the fact that she knows her husband has hepatitis B and was beaten severely prior to his arrest. She is constantly worried about him not being able to see him as he is incommunicado. In 2007, he was put in a very small cell with 60 other inmates. Their water was so contaminated with soil and trash that they had to use their socks to filter the water. In addition, there was a lot of harassment from the prisoners in the same cell, and also puts a lot of stress with constant observation and surveillance from the government during his jail time.
You mentioned that he was beaten by thugs in the taxi, or when he was cornered, and that they beat him around the face. Were his teeth broken? Did it require stitches? Did he get any kind of medical attention?
Khi chồng tôi bị đánh ở Nghệ An, thì tức là người của chồng tôi là bị thâm tím rất là nhiều, và bị mắt là bị đọng máu, và khi mà trở về nhà thì chồng tôi cũng chồng tôi có đi khám mắt và đang điều trị. Thế còn thân thể thì bôi thuốc ạ. Còn tiếp theo đó thì chồng tôi cũng có ý định đi khám, nhưng mà chưa kịp đi khám thêm thì đã bị bắt ạ.
During the beating, my husband had suffered a lot of beating to the face, especially he had sustained hemorrhage to the eye globes, and so he was undergoing some evaluation, then he was arrested. In addition, his body was covered with bruises all over.
Has the American personnel at Embassy Hanoi been helpful? Have they tried to visit him? Have they been allowed any access to him? Have they even made the attempt?
Vâng ạ. Nhà xứ quán Mỹ ở Hà Nội thì đã làm những việc là ông đại sứ sứ quán Mỹ đã có mời tôi đến tại nhà riêng để gặp gỡ, an ủi và giúp đỡ, và ông đại sứ sứ quán Mỹ cũng đã gửi tặng chồng tôi một cuốn kinh thánh để tôi có thể đem vào trại giam cho chồng tôi. Nhưng khi tôi mang đến trại giam thì cuốn kinh thánh này đã không được phép, và tôi không được phép gửi kinh thánh cho chồng tôi. và tôi có thể gặp nhân viên sứ quán Mỹ cũng như là người bí thư thứ nhất ở sứ quán Mỹ bất kỳ lúc nào tôi có thể.
Immediately after his arrest, I was invited to the private residence of U.S. Ambassador Ted Osius, and he gave a lot of support and comfort. Especially, he also gave me a Bible to give to my husband while he is imprisoned. However, when I brought the Bible, it was denied, so my husband never received the Bible. In addition, the embassy has mentioned that I could meet with them at any time.
Let me just make a couple of final observations and ask if you have anything further you'd like to say. I can assure you we will continue our efforts. I see Dr. Tong from Boat People SOS is here today. I've met, as I mentioned earlier, your husband in Hanoi on a human rights trip in 2005 at his law offices. And even though he spoke glowingly about his vision of a Vietnam where everyone possessed fundamentally recognized human rights, universally recognized human rights, there was a total absence of malice on his part towards the people in the government. I mean, when I hear that the government, as you have pointed out, has cited Article 88 of Vietnam's Penal Code conducting propaganda against the state, I was with him privately. Matter of fact, some of the people who were en route were detained and were not allowed to go to his law office that day to meet with me. But there was no propaganda against the state. There was a love for the Vietnamese people that was very deep and very profound, which I found I was almost speechless, how he could have endured so much, known about so much wrongdoing, and yet he spoke about human rights in the most purest of terms, and had such a clarity of purpose about him. And so the Vietnamese government needs to know that we are inspired by Nguyen Van Dai, and growing numbers of members of parliaments, congresses will rally to his defense. And your testimony has sent a clear message to the world, not just at this venue, but everywhere else where you have spoken. How can a government do what they're doing to your husband, who only desires the best for the country of Vietnam? So I want you to know that you have been an inspiration, and he has been an inspiration. When I met with Mr. Dai, again with Dr. Tong, a year later here, again, I was touched by, in my office, with that absence of malice. He did not engage in tirades against Vietnam or its government. He spoke about defending human rights and caring for the disenfranchised, the people of faith, which I found just incredible. And I do hope that that is not lost. There are always reformers in any dictatorship or in any repressive government. They need to know when he's away from them, when he's talking to members of Parliament or Congress in his office or in Washington, his message was one of hope for the people of Vietnam. And so I want you to know what an inspiration your presence here is today. If President Obama were sitting here where I'm sitting, or if the Prime Minister of Vietnam was sitting here, what would you say?
Dạ vâng, khi mà nếu như có Tổng thống ở tại đây thì tôi cũng sẽ muốn gửi đến Tổng thống rằng xin hãy giúp đỡ cho dân tộc Việt Nam, xin cũng hãy đấu tranh cho Việt Nam có nhân quyền, bởi vì người Việt Nam đã rất là khổ trong rất là nhiều năm, và xin ông hãy có tiếng nói khi mà đến Việt Nam, cho việc trả tự do cho các tù nhân lương tâm, và mong muốn ông sẽ nhấn mạnh đến trường hợp của anh Đài, là một người rất là điển hình trong công việc đấu tranh nhân quyền, bởi vì khi đòi hỏi trả tự do cho anh Đài thì cũng giống như là cũng giống như anh Đài cũng giống như một biểu tượng cho nhiều người ở tại Việt Nam trong công việc đấu tranh. Vì vậy trả tự do cho anh Đài cũng giống như là đấu tranh nhân quyền cho Việt Nam ạ.
If the president were sitting here in front of me, I would plead with him to help the people of Vietnam. When he fights for human rights in Vietnam, he helps the people. The people of Vietnam have suffered a lot through all these years of war. And now, if the president could help to promote human rights in Vietnam, that is what I ask for. The reason they arrested my husband and now I'm asking for his release while the president is there is because he represents a symbol of nonviolent fighting for human rights and democracy in Vietnam. And that is why his release would be crucial for the people of Vietnam. And that would also be symbolic of the president's support for such movement in Vietnam. And as you have requested, I have just a few more points to add, please.
Tôi xin phép được nói thêm một chút về cái việc mà họ bắt giữ anh Đài. Bởi vì tôi muốn nói là cái ngày mà 16 tháng 12 năm 2015, khi mà có khoảng 30 người công an đã đến nhà tôi để bắt giữ chồng tôi, khi mà đến thì họ không đưa ra được một cái bằng chứng cụ thể nào cho cái việc bắt giữ chồng tôi, và họ đã khi đến thì họ đã đọc lệnh bắt chồng tôi theo điều 88 Bộ luật hình sự, và sau đó họ đọc lệnh tạm giam 4 tháng, và sau đó họ lục soát nhà. Thế thì khi mà những cái mà họ thu giữ được ở trong gia đình, đó là những cái cuốn sách về xã hội dân sự do Sứ quán Mỹ phát hành, rồi họ thu giữ tất cả những cái gì mà có liên quan đến vấn đề nhân quyền, ví dụ như là sách vở của Liên Hiệp Quốc, nhân quyền của Liên Hiệp Quốc, rồi cái biểu tượng chim bồ câu là biểu tượng về nhân quyền, thậm chí in ở trên những cái bì thư hay là những tờ rơi thì họ cũng thu giữ giống như là một tang vật, rồi ngay cả những cái áo phông có in chữ Hồng Kông Today, Việt Nam Tomorrow thì cũng bị bắt giống như là một tang vật, và tôi thấy rằng chồng tôi là người đấu tranh rất là ôn hòa, không có vũ khí, không có bạo động, và hoàn toàn đấu tranh nhân quyền một cách hết sức là trong sáng cho đất nước Việt Nam, nhưng những hành động của chồng tôi bị coi như là tội phạm, thì tôi cũng xin gửi điều đó tới Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ.
I would like to present to you, Mr. Chairman, and also the U.S. Congress, that I would like to plead the case of my husband. I did not understand why he was arrested under Penal Code Article 88 when he is a human rights activist for nonviolent movements. And also, when they came to the House, they took away the issue of civil society that was published by the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam. They also took away any materials that my husband has from the United Nations Human Rights Council, especially even the symbol of the dove, which my husband believes it represents peace and nonviolent movement for human rights. They took everything, envelopes, papers, anything that has that symbol on it. And then one particular thing that I would like to point out is all the T-shirts that has the word Hong Kong today, Vietnam tomorrow were also confiscated as an artifact to be used against my husband.
Và khi mà cái lý do tôi sang đây để đi vận động trả tự do cho chồng tôi ở nước ngoài vì lý do vào năm 2007 khi mà chồng tôi bị bắt thì ngày nào tôi cũng có mặt ở tất cả những cái cơ quan của Việt Nam để muốn họ giúp đỡ, và tôi đã viết hàng trăm thư khiếu nại tới tất cả các cái cấp bậc ở tại Việt Nam, và tôi cũng đã và tôi cũng đến rất là nhiều các cái cơ quan, ví dụ như là an ninh điều tra, viện kiểm sát, tòa án, trại giam, rồi mặt trận Tổ quốc, và rất là nhiều các cái cơ quan, nhưng mà tất cả những nơi đó đều quay lưng lại đối với tôi, và dường như họ không muốn tiếp đón, và tất cả những đơn thư khiếu nại của tôi gửi thì họ đều không trả lời. Vì vậy tôi rất là thất vọng trong cái việc mà muốn chính quyền Việt Nam giúp đỡ và bảo vệ chồng tôi.
To share with you my thoughts why I am here. And first, thank you so much for holding this hearing. This is very important. It is because back in 2007, I had written over hundreds of complaints to different agencies and never heard anything back. This time, I have tried the same, written many complaints, and also visited many of the agencies just to try and see if anyone could respond to my request. And none of them had responded in any way, verbally or writtenly, to me. And I have met with a lot of obstructions and ignorance from these agencies. In addition, I feel that because if I could go outside at my own risk and raise this voice to the world, then I would be able to present my husband's case so that more people would know about the situation in Vietnam. And my husband is just one of the many people who are in similar situation.
Và lần trước, ngày nào tôi cũng có mặt ở tại cái cơ quan đang thụ lý hồ sơ của chồng tôi. Vì vậy cho nên là tôi liên tục đến, ngày nào tôi cũng đến an ninh điều tra để hỏi về sự việc của chồng tôi. Nhưng mà tôi không thấy họ trả lời là, rồi đến một ngày tôi thấy họ nói là đã kết thúc điều tra và hồ sơ của chồng tôi đã được gửi đến viện kiểm sát. Nhưng khi mà tôi lên viện kiểm sát thì trong vòng 3 ngày thì viện kiểm sát đã trả lời tôi là họ đã gửi thư lên tòa án, và trong cái bản kết luận điều tra của viện kiểm sát có những cái sự rất là khác thường. Họ chỉ để họ không có ngày ở trên cái bản trên cái bản cáo trạng đó, mà chỉ viết là vào tháng 4 năm 2007. Và khi chuyển đến tòa án thì cái ngày xử án là ngày 11 tháng 5, nhưng mà luật sư nhận được giấy bào chữa vào ngày mùng 2 tháng 5, có nghĩa rằng chỉ có 9 ngày để chuẩn bị hồ sơ vụ án. Luật sư chỉ có 9 ngày để chuẩn bị hồ sơ vụ án.
Just to recount what happened in 2007, the lawyer only had 7 days to prepare for his trial back then. Specifically, when I went to the investigation unit, they had sent the papers to the judicial office, but there is no clear evidence against my husband at that time. So, in fact, I'm very worried about similar situation this time.
Và tôi đang rất là lo lắng, không biết là lần này tình trạng của chồng tôi như thế nào. Chồng tôi có bị cái thời gian luật sư tham gia vụ án có bị ngắn như lần trước không? Nếu mà như vậy thì luật sư sẽ không thể đủ thời gian để có thể giúp đỡ cho chồng tôi được.
I am really worried that if that repeats, that the lawyers for Dai only has a few days, just like the previous time, then there is not enough time for them to prepare the trial for Dai.
Và tôi rất là mong muốn, tất nhiên cái điều mà tôi ước ao đó là chồng tôi phải được trả tự do ngay tức khắc và vô điều kiện. Nhưng mà nếu trong trường hợp phải ra tòa thì tôi cũng hy vọng rằng luật sư của tôi không bị bất công như vậy.
So I would like to request that my husband be released unconditionally and immediately. But in case he does go to trial, I really want a fair trial and also for his lawyers to have the time to prepare for his case.
Tôi rất là cảm ơn ông và các cộng sự của ông cũng như là những người ở tại đây đã giúp tôi có cái buổi điều trần này. Tôi cũng xin ông có thể viết thư cho Tổng thống Obama và và không biết là Tổng thống có thể trả lời cho tôi sau cái buổi điều trần này không?
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing. Please accept my deep gratitude and also to all the staff members who have made this possible. I really appreciate all of your caring and support throughout this very difficult time for myself, my husband, and my family. I would like to know, as a request, whether Mr. Chairman, together with other members of Congress, could write a letter to President Obama asking for his response, first to this hearing and also to other requests that have been put in my statement previously. Thank you.
Ms. Vu, thank you. We'll be more than happy to send your statement and a letter encouraging the President, an appeal to the President to raise your husband's case and that of other prisoners of conscience in a specific fashion, not an oblique mention in a wind-up statement or some generality. There needs to be specific requests made so that we can gauge whether or not Vietnam is about to move in the right direction or continues its deterioration when it comes to human rights. There are a number of areas where human rights violations are worsening, human trafficking, religious freedom, and the administration could today designate Vietnam as a CPC country of particular concern. The facts warrant it, and they also could be known as a Tier 3 country when it comes to egregious violations of sex and labor trafficking, especially labor trafficking in Vietnam. So the President has tools in his toolbox, the President of the United States. We hope that he uses them. We'll send, as per your request, your testimony and your strong appeal, backed up by our strong appeal. We'll do it immediately. And again, I hope the President is specific. Just some general statement about human rights doesn't cut it. It hasn't in any other country around the world. It hasn't in Vietnam. He needs to be specific. So I want to thank you again for your very brave testimony. Thank you for your husband's tremendous personal sacrifice for the cause of Vietnam human rights and religious freedom. He is a truly remarkable man, as are others who are fighting this battle with nonviolence and with faith. Know that our prayers are with you and with him. We are in solidarity with them, I can assure you. And I would like to note for the record that we will be having a follow-up hearing to this hearing in mid-June, latter part of June, 23rd or so, and we will be assessing the President's trip and whether or not any progress was indeed made. So again, I want to thank you so very much for your testimony. Dr. Bing, thank you for your very fine translation. The hearing is adjourned.